And this sort of indirectly links, I think, to the issues, that have been with grooming gangs, and very unfortunate that a lot of English girls were victims of that. But the way the gangs operated have been through a sort of a tribal system as well, and a cousin marriage features or sort of fuels a part of that system.
Today, I want to ask about a controversial and touchy topic amongst some in Britain. This is cousin marriage, and it actually impacts more people than perhaps people first realise. There's lots of communities and groups in Britain who have high rates of cousin marriage. I just want to get your broad view on that topic, whether it should be banned or not. A Conservative Member of Parliament, Richard Holden, tried to introduce legislation earlier which would ban cousin marriage.
Well, the answer is yes. I do support the proposed ban. I'm supporting Richard Holden. At the moment, I mean, I'm just a one-man band. I don't have political office at the moment, although I did stand for Parliament in 2005, and I do hope to stand again if I'm accepted, if I'm approved onto the parliamentary list with the Conservative Party, and then I can have more influence. The reason why I'm supporting, Stephen, the Richard Holden's ban is because of birth defects that do occur. Now, I think the community you were referring to when we were talking offline, some of the Muslim communities, I think mainly the Pakistani heritage, the cousin marriages have been fairly common. Roughly 60% of marriages in that community have been cousin marriages. And I think that reflects the same statistic in Pakistan, the country of origin, where the rates are 60%. So when I say the birth defects, there's an increased risk of birth defects, not just genetic, but probably in future mental health issues, etc. And you use the term controversy. Okay. See, from my perspective, this should not be a controversial issue, especially amongst the Muslim community, because there is precedent, Islamic precedent, to move away from marrying relatives. Okay, and that was mentioned by Prophet Muhammad, where he said, marry non-relatives so that your children are not weak. Now, those sayings of the Prophet are seen as weak, okay, and that's why it's not taken seriously. But if we look at Muslim scholars that came later in the 12th century, like Ibn Qadama, he actually made the link between intelligence and marrying relatives, right? And those who are watching, and especially if there are Muslims who are watching, this is probably news to them because they don't know this. I didn't know this until I did some research on this. Because he said this will have an effect on intelligence. Now, about 900 years later, so what he hypothesized and what Prophet Muhammad said in the 6th century and what Ibn Qadama said in the 12th century was shown to be true 900 years later, when there are many, many studies now, genetic studies, to look at, that show negative consequences. So there's one study, an Israeli study that's conducted by an Israeli Muslim, Hasan Abu Saad. He looked at 221 children of Bedouin Arabs in the Negev desert in southern Israel. And what he found was that of those who were products of cousin marriages, 70% had IDD. That's intellectual and development disabilities, 70% of those of cousin marriages. There were moderate IDD and 20% had severe. And of course, you have the Bradford study as well. So although I mentioned 60% from Pakistan, in Bradford, this stats for cousin marriages was actually higher, I think into the 90%. But the reason why this shouldn't be controversy, as I've mentioned, there is Islamic precedent to move away from marrying relatives, is that in Bradford, I think there's a change taking place. So there was a follow-up study done, I think, in 2016 to 2020, where it was a follow-on from the previous Bradford study, and the rates of cousin marriages have actually gone down to about 43%, which is good news. And I think that there's been cooperation from the communities, from the imams, and especially the imams, they sort of give guidance to our communities. Where they're coming on board. So hopefully we should see a generational change. Now, I'm from the Bangladeshi community, not Pakistani, although we are ex-Pakistanis, right? So Bangladesh separated in 1971. But effectively, it's still my community, the Muslim community. So I see this as having a family discussion rather than one community against another community. It isn't.
Why do you think it impacts Pakistanis from who live in Bradford or live in other areas of Britain, particularly from rural Pakistan in particular, and not say Bangladeshis or other Muslim communities?
Yeah, I think it's related to the tribal system that has come about. It's known as the Biraderi system. And one of my acquaintances, a good friend, Patrick Nash, who's an Oxford academic, has published books and papers by Oxford University and Cambridge University. He's done some detailed studies on the Biraderi tribalistic system. So I think, and it's, as you say, as you alluded to, it's not all Muslims, not the whole Muslim communities around the world, but the tribal system, especially when you mention part of Pakistan, which I think is the Kashmir region, there is a name for that. It's because they want to protect the tribe, right? Keep the properties within the family. And there'll be all sorts of reasons why they want to marry cousins. And I think a cohort of that may end up as forced marriages. So you have to marry your cousin. So I think it's to do with maintaining the tribalistic system. And there was a stat that I shared on another interview, which is that 85% of Pakistanis in the UK would prefer to choose their own spouse, their own partners. But if 60%, or now down to 40%, are in cousin marriages, then it shows that there is an element of pressure being applied to force them to marry cousins. And that sort of feeds into this tribal system. And this sort of indirectly links, I think, to the issues, that have been with grooming gangs. And very unfortunate that a lot of English girls were victims of that. But the way the gangs operated have been through a sort of a tribal system as well, and a cousin marriage features or sort of fuels a part of that system.
Because you have a community that's very tight-knit, that is, as you say, kind of tribal, clannish, where perhaps external figures, including English girls, are seen as outsiders and in a way fair game compared to the internal family or clan community. Is that basically what the argument you're making?
Possibly they might be, the English girls might be seen as fair game, but they shouldn't do. That's the whole point. Because if they did these things back in their home countries, they'd face capital punishment, because raping is not allowed. Right, under Muslim law, it's not allowed. There's serious consequences. Now, why do they view English girls that way? I don't have an answer to that. Because what I've read some reports about how these gangs operated, they may drug some of these girls, give them alcohol. All of these are anathema to our religion. Complete opposite, and raping, complete opposite. So it's more. So these are antithesis to the Islamic religion. So what is actually driving them? I don't know.
It seems like a national issue. I mean, I think that it's impacted the whole country.
Yes.
And not just a northern issue. But going back to cousin marriage, and maybe we'll get on to the grooming gangs a bit later. There are people who defend cousin marriage. We've had several members of parliament defend it, and they might make the argument that it's a tradition, it's our culture, and who are you to say we should ban it? And particularly talking about yourself, they may say, well, why are you going against your own community, your own fellow Muslims? That's not right. You should be defending us.
Well, there's a difference between culture and religion, as we see being played out here. Now, although cousin marriage is certainly allowed in Islam, there is an act of discouragement by the Prophet himself. So if they're actively defending a cousin marriage, there's a difference between something that's allowed and making it compulsory. And it seems that in some communities, they've made cousin marriage compulsory for those reasons I've mentioned before about the tribal clan. So there is precedent, Islamic precedent, to actually challenge that. So if I'm asked the question, who are you? I'm a fellow Muslim who's trying to follow what Prophet Muhammad said and what the Muslim scholars had said in the past. And also the question you're asking me, ask those children that same question who have been affected by cousin marriages, who have genetic defects. Who are you to challenge our communities. Well, look at these children. In Birmingham and Redbridge, around 20% of child deaths can be attributed to consanguineous marriages. In Bradford, it was up to 43%. Okay, and for a reference I have is from the Bradford Children's Safeguarding Board 2016 to 2018, so you can do a Google search on that. So they look at 69 deaths. 43% of those deaths were from cousin marriages. So if you know that there's going to be an increased risk, look outside. The Prophet Muhammad said, look outside the family circle. I'm the world's your oyster. Why be tribalistic? And also, if I may, when I was at the Tory conference in 2001, this was after the 9/11 attack, so I talked about, condemning terrorism. I quoted my favourite verse from the Quran, which is chapter 49, verse 13, which says, "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and female, and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other, not despise each other." Right? And the ex-Prime Minister Theresa May quoted the same verse in 2018 at the Tory conference. It's about understanding. Yes, tribes are created, but so that we can understand each other, reach out to other communities. So this tribalistic mentality goes completely against the ethos of what our religion is meant to stand for.
Do you feel that there's been a certain silence around this issue of cousin marriage amongst Muslim leaders, imams in Britain so far?
Probably, because they probably don't see this as an issue to be addressed during a Friday sermon. But that Bradford study I referred to, where there seems to be a change in the rates of cousin marriages, was down to 43%, still way too high. But the trajectory is actually positive. What I read was that there was cooperation from the imams there and the local community through education there. So I think there could be more scope for imams to give guidance on this when it comes to your marriage partners, as well as other things we touched on, like grooming gangs, terrorism, extremism. A lot more can be done.
When it comes to other arguments against cousin marriage, you talk about the birth defects,
Yeah.
obviously the medical problems that arise from it. Are there moral arguments also against cousin marriage from a sort of principled position that you shouldn't marry your relatives? It just seems, for example, you wouldn't marry your sister or your brother, and for many people in Britain, marrying your cousin is kind of along the same lines. It just doesn't seem right, just from an instinctive, principled perspective.
Yeah, so it depends because cousin marriage is anathema to West at the moment, and I think it comes from the previous ecclesiastical law by the Catholic Church, where they did ban cousin marriage, although there is biblical precedence of cousin marriage. So Isaac, Prophet Isaac, he married his two cousins, Rebecca and Leah. And Isaac's son Esau, he married his cousin Mahalath, who's the daughter of Ishmael. So there is biblical precedence. Having said that, the church, the ecclesiastical law did actually ban it. And that's why it's no longer seen as something that is common. Although if we go back to all of our ancestries, there were cousin marriages. So Richard Dawkins made a very good point in his book, An Ancestor's Tale, A Pilgrimage to the Dawn of Life. If you look at one person, who's got two parents, each parent has two parents. So if you fan out and go backwards in time, the population should increase. In fact, it decreases. Why? Because of cousin marriages. So I'm pretty sure every one of us, including those who are looking, will have cousin marriages in the ancestry. But you're right, coming back to your question, how would you feel? Is there a moral element to this? I think it depends on the individual. This would seem to be abhorrent to those who are growing up in the West, those who are growing up in, as you say, in parts of Pakistan. In Bangladesh, my country of origin, 17% are still cousin marriages, probably more from the village areas. They'll see this as common. So what's going to inform our morality? It's going to be certainly the religious foundations of that. So, yeah, the church has banned it. The Anglican Church, I don't think, has banned it because there's precedents in the royal families where there have been cousin marriages, but it's looked down on.
So Henry VIII, I think,
Yes.
he wanted to marry his cousin, so he didn't ban it.
Quite, yeah, Catherine Howard. So, and you look at the Habsburg dynasty, that ended in 1700 when Charles II could not produce any more heirs because of these birth defects. So I hope that's sort of answered your question.
The other argument some make in favour of cousin marriage, and against this argument about the medical side of things, is that, yes, okay, there are some medical issues in some small minority of cases. However, this is just the equivalent of women having babies later in life. There's also a risk of that happening. So, we shouldn't ban it because the risk is there for people who are older and have children, and it should be up to the individual what they want to do.
Yes, that has been a pushback. Now, my pushback to that pushback is this. Yes, there are some women, I think over 40, or is over 35, where the risk increases and becomes equivalent to the risk of congenital defects of cousin marriages. If if women over 35 or over 40 giving birth to children was more common, if it was prevalent, then there would be questions. Questions would be asked, and I'm sure this would have policy implications on how to mitigate that. So because that hasn't happened yet, therefore, it's a nonsensical argument. Smoking is an example that has been fairly common, but there are clear health issues with smoking, the potential for cancer, etc. That's why over a long period of time, the government has eventually is trying to phase out smoking, and eventually it will happen with a ban. The previous government under Rishi Sunak mentioned. So where there are prevalent health issues, they will be addressed. But women over 40 giving birth, that's not a prevalent issue.
When it comes to banning cousin marriage, do you think that it could antagonise Pakistani communities in Britain, or would it encourage integration?
Well, I'm hoping that the ban will run in parallel to an already declining cousin marriages up in Bradford, for example. So I see this running in parallel. What the ban will also do is send a signal, because some obviously could circumvent this, go out to the country's origin, get married and come back with their cousin. But it will send out a strong signal that this is not allowed, and it runs in parallel to what's already happening through education, right? And I think the ban will also mitigate some of the forced marriages we do see amongst cousins. So I think it'll catalyse the process that's already happening in Bradford, for example, of a declining rate in cousin marriages. So it should not be seen as Islamophobic, especially when there is Islamic precedent by the Prophet and by some of the Muslim scholars in the past. So how can it be Islamophobic?
Do you feel that there are communities in Britain who still today are not integrated at all? So cousin marriage may be one example of the issues. You talked about forced marriage as well, obviously that's connected. But also issues like FGM, this is female genital mutilation, which impacts, unfortunately, too many people in Britain today, and obviously around some Muslim countries. So do you feel that there's a real issue with thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Britain who refuse to accept Western cultural practices and moral values on things that, people born in England, English people would think this is abhorrent?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've had a thought about this, and because I've always felt, being myself, I've stood for Parliament before, I've been involved with Prevent, to counter extremism myself. There are a lot of Muslims who are fully integrated in society, in politics, in business, education, law, etc. If there is a cohort that is isolated, then that should be called out. Because if the cohort does not like Britain, then what are we doing here? But there is another side to this, which has been brought out by the recent march in London, Tommy Robinson's march, is that on the one hand, I think the Muslim community in general is seen as not integrating. On the other hand, if the community does integrate, take part in the facets of life I just mentioned, then they're accused of wanting to take over the UK through Sharia law, etc. So the question I have put, and I have not met Tommy Robinson, and I think it will be inappropriate because of the legalities there, but I have asked someone to relay this question: what can Muslims do differently so that we are seen as integrated and not trying to take over the UK? What do we need to do differently? So that's a question I would actually put back. But yes, if there are areas where there's no integration, that should be called out. We should reach out and build bridges. And what I try to have done in the past in different companies, I have run diversity and inclusion sessions where different communities can talk to each other, including the English communities. And I think that's the way forward, talking to each other and bridge building.
The Henry Jackson Society did a poll of British Muslims
Right.
after the October 7th attacks.
Right.
And I'll read some of the results. 46% of respondents said they had more sympathy with Hamas than for Israel. Again, this is after October 7th, in which more than 1,200 Israelis were killed, civilians were killed by this terrorist group. 29% of British Muslims held a quite positive or very positive view of Hamas, 15% describing it as very positive, 14% as quite positive. Only 24% believed Hamas actually committed murder and rape during October 7th, despite all the evidence that they did so. And 29% viewed it as desirable to implement Sharia law in the UK within the next 20 years. So this isn't a minority, well, it is a minority, but this isn't a small minority of British Muslims. This is a significant minority of British Muslims, according to this poll. And I've seen other examples of this, where people are saying we have sympathy for a terrorist organisation. Or, for example, implementing Sharia law, again, quite a radical position to most kind of British people looking at that, thinking, well, we don't want Sharia law, that's not our religion. So, do you think that there's issues here with integration? How do we solve this problem if so many Muslims in Britain have these views or hold these views?
Yeah, what was the name of the report?
Henry Jackson Society is a...
Oh, sorry, Henry Jackson, of course. Yeah. I mean, I'm fairly positive with the I haven't interacted with Henry Jackson Society, and in fact, I did a few years ago. I did invite one of the officers to visit a Muslim school that I was a governor of at that time in Slough. But I know the Henry Jackson Society is seen as something that's really out there by many Muslims, which is very unfortunate because there are, I think, a lot of commonalities. I personally don't see a contradiction between living your life as a Muslim. I am a practicing Muslim and British values. I don't see a contradiction there. So some of the stats you mentioned where a significant proportion supported Hamas. No, I would definitely call that out, absolutely, because terrorism is not allowed. As I've said, grooming gangs, drugging, giving alcohol, raping, they're not allowed. Terrorism is not allowed either. So I'll be surprised as to why.
You mean within Islam?
Yeah, within Islam, absolutely. So what are we doing? So as Muslims, Jews, Christians, what are we doing to bring about peace in the Middle East? So what I have tried to do as a Muslim, I reached out to our rabbi, Simon Jacobson in New York. We've had two dialogues just after the October 7th attacks and last year, dialogue two, How can Jews and Muslims unite and Christians so that peace is achieved in the Holy Land? This is the land of Abraham. This is the land of Jews, Christians and Muslims. What are the commonalities? That is a discussion we should be having. And I think Saudi Arabia was on the verge of recognizing the state of Israel and the Abraham Accords, which I do support, where there would have been peace would have been ushered in, and the people of Gaza, Palestinians would have, the march towards a Palestinian state would have been seen. And I think David Cameron, when he was the foreign minister, recently he did say that the march towards a Palestinian state is now unstoppable, which is good news. But that was all scuppered by Hamas. Unfortunately, why did they intervene on October the 7th when they knew that the gates of hell would open? Why did they do that? And we see the absolute devastation in Gaza, and of course the plight of the hostages and the killings that have taken place and rape, as you mentioned. This is not what Muslims, Jews and Christians stand for. What can we do to unite? And especially when talking about Jews, I was telling the rabbi, there are more commonalities between Islam and Judaism, Jews and Muslims, than there are differences. There are the tools to unite in the Holy Land, the land of Abraham, but we're not doing that. We're just fighting over land. So, and I condemn those who have supported Hamas. They intervened on October the 7th to scupper the Abraham Accords, which would have ushered in peace for everyone. And if you don't believe in peace, my sort of retort to them is, if you support Hamas, and what it has ensued, and of course the IDF has a responsibility as well in what's happened with the humanitarian disaster. If you support continued war, then it means you don't support peace. Then you're not being pro Gaza, you're not being pro Palestinian, let alone being pro Israeli civilians.
You say Muslims don't support Hamas, obviously, but as I mentioned, this poll suggests that a lot of them do. I think there are more than 4 million Muslims in Britain, and if we're talking 29% have a positive or fairly positive view of Hamas, that's potentially more than 1 million Muslims in Britain supporting a terrorist group. I mean, how can we solve this problem? This is not good.
Yeah, I think more dialogue and discussion. So when I wanted to do a parliament in 2005, I did engage with a thankfully now banned Muslim group, the Al Muhajirun. They're antecedents. Hezbollah Tahrir in 1990s, they caused a lot of problems at university. So I did try to confront them. And in 2005, when they accused me of all sorts of bad things, I challenged them to a debate about terrorism in general, because they supported or seemed to support the 9/11 attacks. One week before the debate was due to take place, a spokesman for Al Muhajirun rang and said it's not wise for Muslims to be seen in public arguing with each other. And this is after they excommunicated me. I suddenly become a Muslim. I knew why they didn't back down, because they have no legs to stand on. Islamically, they cannot justify the killing of innocent civilians. That's for sure. And yes, in wartime there is obviously precedence to fight, but there are limits to warfare, and that's the discussion I had with the rabbi as well. What can Muslims do or cannot do? So I would confront them. So to answer your question, how do we solve this problem? 29%. Speak to them, where the role of the imams are very, very crucial as well, to condemn terrorism in their Friday sermons. So when the October 7th attacks took place, and before the Israeli retaliation, there's a clear, humanitarian disaster in Gaza. But before the retaliation, which imam actually condemned this in their Friday sermons? And this is something I have actually called out. They should have condemned this. These are innocent Israeli, mostly Jewish civilians that have been killed. Some Israeli Arabs were targeted as well. But the solution is peace. That's the answer.
What do you say to the British people who have a serious anxiety about some Muslims in our country who are extremists? So I know we saw this march of the weekend with Tommy Robinson, hundreds of thousands potentially kind of patriotic people on the streets who are very concerned about some of these issues. We've seen in recent years the terrorist attack in Manchester, in which little girls were killed by an extremist. We saw a member of parliament, Sir David Amess, murdered by a Muslim extremist. As you mentioned, the grooming gangs committed by largely Pakistani men, a lot of them were Muslim. And there clearly is a lot of anxiety from British people, or some British people, over these issues. There's calls to deport a lot of Muslims, calls to deport a lot of extremists from Britain. What would you say to them and their anxieties? What was your message for them?
Well, deport the terrorists for sure, the terrorist sympathisers. Now, my message to them is that Islam is not a threat. Okay, I think we should look inwardly as well as a Muslim community. What have we done to mitigate some of these concerns? Grooming gangs, rape, that's not allowed. Terrorism, killing innocent people, that is not allowed. And I don't think this idea of a takeover. I don't know if you heard of the term taqiyya. A lot of the anti-Islam critics will use that term. Taqiyya means secret, so do things in secret, appear, to do something the opposite to what you really believe, and there might be a taqiyya takeover. I don't believe that this is the case. When Sir Richard Dearlove, he was the head of MI6. When he came on one of the radio stations, I asked him when I called in, after I thanked him for his service to our country, do you believe that there is a threat to the UK by Islam itself? His answer was no, because he's one of the very few people in the world who knows exactly what's going on underground and where the real threats are. But he did say that there is threat from extremism, which I agree with. There is a threat from there. And the Muslim extremists, they are the threats to Islam, not these far-right people, not ex-Muslims. I've seen a lot of ex-Muslims, not Christian apologists. They're coming from within, okay? So we have to do what we can to mitigate that, the internal threat to Islam, which is from Muslim extremists. So the threat is not from Muslims. I think more engagement in dialogue with the wider English community if they feel the country's been taken over. It isn't, and it didn't help when Elon Musk made that statement at Tommy Robinson's rally that there is an impending civil war. I don't think there is. And my message to Elon Musk would be this, that don't talk down Britain by talking up a civil war, okay, when it's not likely to happen. The only civil war that's happening, unfortunately, is within the Conservative movement. So Musk versus Trump. Within the UK, you've got the official Conservative Party, which I'm a part of, and obviously I do want to see Prime Minister Kemi Badenoch in due course, but we see differences now between the UKIP, between you've got Advance now, Advance UK, Reform. All they're going to do is cut the Tory vote, or cut the Conservative vote, so that Labour gets in. That's all that's going to happen. So I don't know how we got to this, but
yeah. Well, let's end the interview by talking about Charlie Kirk.
Okay.
This American conservative obviously was assassinated recently, potentially by a far left terrorist. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that. Some people on the left are claiming he's on the right, but I think the casings on the bullets saying "catch this fascist" and so on suggests otherwise. What's your response to Charlie Kirk's murder?
Yeah, it was absolutely abhorrent. When Charlie Kirk was in hospital, when I heard about that, I prayed that he does recover, but unfortunately he went back, to his creator. It was absolutely abhorrent, and assuming that the terrorist was from the far left. What did concern me was that there was some celebration from that political people who belong to that political ideology, which is concerning, because what people may disagree with him for his Christian values or whatever what he was advocating, but to kill someone, to celebrate a death, is abhorrent, because all he was doing was having a conversation with his adversaries in a polite, courageous manner. And that's a legacy I think he has left behind, is to speak to your adversaries with kindness, compassion and courage. That's the legacy which all of us, whether we're the left or the right, can actually follow. So I'm in dialogue with someone on the left in America at the moment who seemed to have, I wouldn't say celebrated, but he said that the world is a better place without him. And this is shocking, because there have been Democrats who were assassinated. So you have Melissa Hortman in Minnesota who was assassinated by someone on the right. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, there was an attempted murder of him. How would people react if those on the right celebrated their deaths? Conservatives don't do that. We just don't do that. The murder of Joe Cox, the Labour MP Joe Cox, that was abhorrent. There was wide condemnation, no celebration whatsoever. As you mentioned earlier, the murder of David Amos by a Muslim extremist. So you have the far left extremists, you've got Muslim extremists, the far right extremists, Joe Cox. The world is becoming more insane. All the more reason we need to build bridges, and that's exactly what I try to do with my adversaries, is build bridges. What I've said so far, there'll be disagreements from the left, for example, because I'm very much a proud conservative. They will not agree with me on my stance on abortion. I'm ardently pro-life. I believe in capitalism. There'll be those on the right, my fellow compatriots, who will not agree with me either. Okay, and I've called them out for their skepticism about the COVID vaccine. I'm a great believer in the diversity and inclusion initiatives that was enacted by many companies after the George Floyd murder. By that, I don't mean selection. I just mean reaching out, having these sessions. Many on the right may not agree with that. We've got Muslim groups who will not agree with me with my work in Prevent. to counter extremism. I had a bit of a tittle-tattle with an extremist group because they thought that Prevent is a Jewish, Christian, Zionist plot to destroy Islam, which it isn't. But on the other hand, you've got someone like Connor Tomlinson, who I watched a few weeks ago, who's saying that the Home Office in Prevent has been infiltrated by Muslim extremists. I mean, you can't make this up. Something is wrong here. You're going to get, I made a note here actually, and the reason I'm listing this out, Christian apologists, ex-Muslims and Tommy Robinson advocates, they will disagree with me vehemently when I say that Islam is not a threat to the UK or to the West. So you have different pinch points, different opinions here. And here's little Hasan trying to draw a line of best fit. If you imagine a scattergram on a graph, a line of best fit, and trying to connect the dots by building bridges. That is the only way forward.
Thank you so much, Hasan, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed.